The Book of Leviticus, fully summarized. So to start off, God gives to Moses the law of burnt offerings, speaking to him from the tabernacle, and tells him the correct way to make a burnt sacrifice of the herd, of the flocks, and of the birds, so that God can get that sweet, sweet aroma of burning animals. Oh yeah. Males without blemish were demanded, and they were only offered up of a person's free will, and the priests had the duty of performing all the offerings, including cutting up, washing, and gutting the body parts. They were to sprinkle the blood around the altar. These instructions on how to correctly slaughter animals went on for about the first 9 chapters of Leviticus. Animal lovers leave now, but meat lovers come right in. God then explains how to properly offer a grain offering to him, and says that it must be of fine flour and have oil poured on it. And he says that it must be given to the priests who would burn it to the Lord. Then God goes through how the offering would be given up if the offering was baked in an oven or in a covered pan, and no leaven was ever to be used because God hates yeast, but salt was always to be used. Well, that makes sense. I mean, God is pretty salty. And then God gives an explanation on how to offer the first fruits to him, with the priests, of course, taking it and burning it like every other offering. Then God explains how to properly prepare a peace offering to him from the flocks, herds, and goats. And the unblemished animal was always to be killed, burnt, have its blood sprinkled on the altar, have its fat, kidneys, and liver removed and given to God. And it was a super sweet aroma for him. But Israel was commanded never to eat fat or blood, because God was a bloodthirsty fatty patty and wanted it all to himself. And the priests were always to prepare all the offerings on the altar. And then God explains how to properly prepare a sin offering. If a priest or a person of Israel sins, then they must offer a young bull without blemish to the Lord, and its blood must be sprinkled on the altar and poured into the bottom. And the fat, the kidneys, and the liver were to be removed and burnt to appease the Lord with a super sweet aroma. And the rest of the bull was to be dragged out of the camp and burned, and so the sins of Israel would be forgiven. And then the chapter explains that if the entire congregation of Israel sins, pretty much the exact same instructions were to be carried out. Then God says that if a ruler of Israel sins, they must offer a young male goat without blemish, because rulers' sins require dicks, but a vagina will do for commoners' sins. And the priest will cut up the offering and sprinkle its blood on the altar. And the fat was always to be removed and offered to the Lord, and the blood was always to be poured into the base of the altar of the burnt offering. Then the chapter explains that if a common person of Israel sins, they must bring a female goat without blemish in order to make atonement for their sins, and have the priest cut up the offering and sprinkle its blood on the altar. And the fat was always to be removed and offered to the Lord, and the blood was always to be poured into the base of the altar of the burnt offering. And then it explains that if a lamb was offered, it had to be female without blemish in order to make atonement for their sins, and the priest had to cut up the offering and sprinkle its blood on the altar, and the fat was always to be removed and offered to the Lord, and the blood was always to be poured into the base of the burnt offering. Jesus Christ, this is so repetitive. Then the Lord states that if a person ever gives false testimony, touches any unclean thing like an animal carcass, or swears, they must offer a trespass offering to the Lord, because they are guilty, and must give a lamb or goat to the priest to make atonement for themselves. Or if they have none, turtle doves or pigeons, or 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour, and it would be burnt on the altar to the Lord. And you better believe there were detailed instructions for the offerings, but I'm not explaining them anymore. God then states that if anyone violated any of the holy things of the Lord by disobeying his commandments, they were to offer a ram without blemish to the Lord to be forgiven. Then God tells Moses that if a person keeps something belonging to another and lies about it or extorts the person, then he shall return it to its owner and add 1/5 of its value to it, and offer up a ram without blemish to the Lord for atonement. Then God again talked about the burnt, grain, and sin offerings, and all the complicated instructions on how they were to be done for the entire rest of the chapter, and added that Aaron and his sons had to offer a grain offering to the Lord without leaven when they were anointed, and that they were allowed to eat the leftovers of the offerings in a holy place, and the fire of the burning altar was never to go out, and that anyone who offered up the sacrifices had to necessarily be holy. God again gave the law of the trespass offering and all its instructions, with all the fat going to the Lord, and said that Aaron and the priests were to be given the skin of the offering for themselves, as well as the grain offerings baked in the oven, and the meat and oil. Priests get free food. Nice. Then God gave the law of thanksgiving and all the instructions for it, with bread unleavened, as always, as well as more animal sacrifices, which was to be eaten with God. And nothing was to be left by the time of the third day, and if anyone did eat anything on the third day, their guilt would be upon them, because they had committed an abomination. Then God says that no one was to eat of the offering if they had been made unclean by anything, and said that anyone who ate the sacrifice of the peace offering to the Lord and was unclean would be cut off from Israel. Then he commanded again that Israel would not eat any fat or blood, or they would be cut off from Israel, and then he stated how much Aaron and his sons were allowed to eat of the offerings to the Lord. So Aaron and his sons were then consecrated to the Lord by Moses on God's command, in a process involving clothing, washing, anointing with oil and blood, killing animals, pouring blood, eating, slicing and dicing meat, rubbing blood onto ears and thumbs and big toes, boiling and burning animal flesh, bread unleavened, and sacrificing to God, with all the congregation watching at the tabernacle of meeting. And Aaron and his sons stayed in the tabernacle for 7 days as God commanded, so that they would not die. So then on the 8th day, the priestly ministry began. Kind of weird how the guy who made the golden calf for the Israelites to worship instead of God is now becoming a priest, but whatever. And Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel were called by Moses to offer sacrifices to the Lord for atonement, as were the children of Israel. And they did so in the prescribed manner, and Moses gathered the people of Israel to the tabernacle to witness God appear. Aaron performed his priestly duties of killing animals and sprinkling blood and giving God all the fat. So when Aaron and Moses blessed the people, God appeared as a great fire consuming the burnt offering on the altar. And the people were totally amazed and fell on their faces. But Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, offered profane fire to the Lord, using the wrong incense, I guess, and the Lord was displeased and burnt them alive, and said that all who served him had to be holy. So Moses told Aaron and his remaining sons to fall in line with God and not feel bad about their dead family, because they had to do their duty or they would die. Not a great start for the priesthood. Then Moses told them of the proper conduct for priests to have for offerings, and that they should never drink wine or leave the tabernacle, and he told them to always distinguish between the clean and the unclean, and then teach the children of Israel. Then Moses got mad at Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's remaining sons, because they did the sin and burnt offerings wrong, after he had commanded them to offer them up for God. But Aaron stuck up for them for Moses, and Moses calmed down. Then God gave his laws concerning what the Israelites were and were not allowed to eat, and he named many mammals, sea creatures, birds, and insects, because everyone should eat insects since farming them are much better for the environment than livestock. #save the planet, #bug life. And they were labeled as clean and unclean very arbitrarily, with Israel being able to eat whatever divided the cloven hoof and chewed the cud, and anything in the water with fins and scales, which means that shrimp are an absolute abomination to God. Certain birds were not allowed to be eaten, including bats, which are apparently birds, who knew? And all flying insects that walked on 4 legs were also unclean. And the chapter listed the insects people were allowed to eat. The Israelites were not able to eat those unclean foods, nor touch their carcasses, nor anything their carcasses touched, or they too would be unclean. And God didn't want them to be unclean, because he just wanted them to be holy like he was holy. Man, God sure is a neat freak, huh? Then God talked for like a page about more animals that were unclean, including reptiles. Man, what do you got against reptiles, God? They're cool. It also stated that water could be tainted by touching unclean things, and a person needed to cleanse themselves if they had been made unclean, and they would be unclean until evening. Then God stated that after a woman gives birth to a male, the male would need to be circumcised after the 8th day. And for the birth of either gender, she would be unclean, but she would be unclean for twice as long if she gave birth to a girl instead of a boy, because women are filthy, dirty creatures, thus saith the Lord. And she had to go through blood purification to become clean again, and after that she would need to bring a young lamb and a young pigeon or turtle dove to the priest to sacrifice to make the woman clean again. Damn, and I thought the United States wasted a lot of food. These people are giving up animal offerings for damn near everything. Then God gave his law concerning leprosy, and said that anyone who had a white swelling, scab, or sore on any part of their body had to be taken to the priest, who would examine it and isolate the person. And if the sore did not spread and instead faded, then the priest would pronounce that person clean. But if the sore spread and was deep, then the priest would judge him as unclean, and that person would shave all his hair and cover his mustache, and alert anyone who came near to him that he was unclean, and live away from the camp. It also weirdly states that if a person has leprosy all over their body and no raw skin, they are considered clean for some reason. These instructions go on for over 2 entire pages and go over stuff like looking at what the hair color of the leprous person will be, and whether bald people had leprosy, and if they have scales in their skin. And I'm sure these chapters are read all the time in the church. They're so gripping. God continues and also states that priests must judge whether clothing touched by lepers is safe or not, and if it is, then it should be burnt, but if the priest has judged the article of clothing to be safe, then it only needs to be washed and then judged as clean and washed again. So then God explained the ritual for cleansing healed lepers and goes on for about 2 more pages. Great, more freaking leprosy. This is truly the greatest book ever written. I'm so riveted. About how a priest must determine if the person has been healed or not. If the priest determines that the leper has been healed, then the priest should make a sacrifice of 1 clean bird, dip a living bird in the dead bird's blood, and use the living bird to sprinkle the blood on the leper, and then let the living bird go. Next, the healed leper must wash himself and his clothes, and completely shave himself, and stay outside the camp for 7 days. But on the 8th day a lamb was to be killed, and its blood was to be wiped on the right ear, thumb, and big toe, which oil was also supposed to be placed on. The priest would offer the sacrifice and make atonement for the healed leper before the Lord. And the healed leper shall offer only 1 male lamb and a grain offering, or turtle doves and pigeons if he happens to be poor. How thoughtful. To sacrifice to the Lord. Perfectly simple, and not at all completely nonsensical. God also states that if it is suspected that a house is infected with leprosy, even though it's impossible for a building to get leprosy, the priest must come and judge and wait to see if it spreads. And if it does, the house must be deconstructed and the materials transported to some other unclean place. And then the house will be rebuilt in the same spot for some reason. If the leprosy goes away, though, the priest will pronounce a house clean and kill a bird to do the same crap as before, dipping a living bird in the blood of a dead one and using it to sprinkle the blood all over the house in order to cleanse the house, despite that being incredibly unsanitary. Like, was God just screwing with the Israelites when he gave them these laws? I mean, he had to have been. Then God gives his law concerning bodily discharges and states that despite being a completely normal bodily function, whenever a man ejaculates or a woman ejects blood from her vagina, they will be unclean, and everything and everyone they touch will be unclean. So people must wash their clothes and bathe themselves and be unclean until evening. They must wait for 7 days, and then on the 8th day take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and have the priest sacrificing them at the tabernacle to make them clean again. So then they would not defile God with their uncleanliness through their bodily discharges. Then God told Moses that there was a special day that Aaron and his sons were to come into the holy place inside the veil, and if they came at a different time, then they would die. And that Aaron and his sons were to make special preparations, always before ministering to God, to make offerings to the Lord, and dressing in their fancy priest get-ups. This was the Holy Day of Atonement on the 10th day of the 7th month, where 2 goats and 1 bull were to be taken from the children of Israel, 1 goat offered as a sin offering, and the other being a scapegoat that Aaron would transfer all the sins of Israel onto, and then let it escape into the wilderness, and thus all of Israel would be clean of sin again. So let me get this straight. You can escape responsibility for your sins by transferring them to an animal? Makes sense to me. The bull was also to be killed and offered up to the Lord, and have its blood sprinkled on the altar. And the blood of the goat was also to be sprinkled on the altar. And the sin offering was to be burnt on the altar and offered to the Lord as atonement for the iniquity of the Israelites. And yeah, there is some other instructions for the offerings, but the important thing is that it would be a tradition forever according to God, and no one would ever do any work on that day. Then God told Moses that any sacrifice given to him had to be brought to the door of the tabernacle, and if it was not, then God would cut off the person sacrificing from Israel, because God needed the sweet, sweet aroma of the tabernacle sacrifices perpetually in his noses. and whoever did not offer a sacrifice to the Lord would be cut off from Israel. So you can't sacrifice any valuable animals in your own homes, but instead have to give them to the priests every time. I'm sure there is no way this system could be abused whatsoever. Also, no one was ever to consume any blood because it is the source of life, which is why God likes consuming it so much, and if the people did consume blood, then they would be cut off from Israel. Nor should anyone eat anything that died naturally or was killed by an animal. Then God gives his laws of sexual immorality, and stated that no one should ever see any of their family members naked or be in an incestuous relationship, despite the fact that previous characters in the Bible like Abraham were, and he didn't seem to mind. And also you shouldn't collect a harem of women who are closely related to one another, but you can still totally have a harem of women that aren't closely related to one another. Make marriage great again by bringing back polygamy, thus saith the Lord. And also you should not have sex with or even look at a naked woman who is on her period, or commit adultery, or sacrifice your children, even though that has nothing to do with sexual immorality, or have sex with a man, or have sex with an animal, as all these things are things that the other wicked nations engage in, and for that reason God will destroy all those nations, and if anyone disobeys his laws, they will be banished from Israel, for they have defiled themselves. Then God gave out a bunch of moral and ceremonial laws so that his people could be holy, including honor your parents, keep the Sabbath, don't worship other gods or false idols, don't eat peace offerings after the third day, give to the poor and allow them to glean from your harvest, don't lie, don't steal, don't curse, don't cheat, have good judgment, pay fair wages, fear the Lord, love your brother and neighbor and stranger, don't bear grudges, don't mix anything with anything, especially not shampoo and conditioner, that is evil. Don't sleep with someone else's concubine, or that concubine, but not you, will have to be scourged, and you will have to have atonement made for you. Don't eat fruit until the 5th year. Don't eat blood. Don't practice divination or soothsaying. Don't prostitute your daughter, even though in Exodus it literally gave instructions on how to sell your daughter to someone. Don't get tattoos. Don't shave your head or beard or the Taliban. I mean, the Lord's holy enforcers will come for you. Honor the Sabbath, even though that was already commanded earlier. Don't consult mediums, honor your elders, treat immigrants well, make honest measurements, and certainly never forget that I am the Lord! Then God gave out his punishments for the crimes he stated, and the punishment for idolatry and sacrificing one's children to Moloch was death by stoning, and of course anyone who refused to stone the offender would be stoned as well. Divination and turning to mediums was punished by exile. Disrespecting your parents was punished by death. Adultery was punished by death for both the man and the woman. Way to go, God, finally treating women with the equal rights they deserve. Incest was punished by death for both the man and the woman, though in some cases they were merely exiled. Homosexuality was punished by death. Bestiality was punished by death for human and beast. And sleeping with a woman who was on her period was punished by exile. And witches and wizards were to be stoned to death. These are the quote-unquote just commands given by God that separate the Israelites from all the other wicked people of the world, and the Israelites must separate the clean from the unclean and follow all of God's commands. Then God gave his regulations for Aaron and his priesthood, and he told Moses that none of the priests could defile themselves by shaving their heads and beards or cutting their skin, and they could not profane the name of the Lord and had to continually offer sacrifice to him. They could not take any non-virgin wife, and if their daughter became a prostitute, she would be burnt alive. The priests would always be clothed in front of others, and never touch a dead body, nor would any priest profane the sanctuary of God, and no priest would ever have a disability or defect, because God hates cripples, and they were not allowed to enter his sanctuary. Then the Lord states that no unclean person could ever go before anything holy, and if a priest ever becomes unclean for any reason, he must not eat of the holy offering, or else he would die. Also, no alien, hired servant, or priest's daughter married to an outsider would ever eat of the offering, but any child or slave belonging to the priest could eat it, and anyone who ate a holy offering unintentionally had to restore it to the priest in addition to 1/5 of it. Then God states that every animal offered up for sacrifice must be offered up willingly, and must be completely healthy and uninjured with no disabilities, and no animal that died of natural causes, has been killed by an animal, or bought from an alien would be sacrificed. Also, you had to wait 8 days to sacrifice an animal after it is born, and you can't sacrifice a mother and a child on the same day. Just kill them separately. Then the Lord proclaimed, I am the Lord, once again. He really seems to just like to remind his people of that a lot. Then the Lord went on to list all of his official feasts that the Israelites were to follow until the end of time, including the Sabbath, where no work was to be done, the Passover, where unleavened bread is to be eaten and no work was to be done, and an offering was to be given up to the Lord for that sweet, sweet aroma. And you better believe there are a lot more complicated animal sacrifice instructions given out in this chapter. The Feast of the First Fruits, where fruits, grain, wine, and male lambs are sacrificed to God. No grain was to be eaten, and no work was to be done. The Feast of the Weeks, where no work was to be done, and the extra food is left for the poor. The Feast of the Trumpets, where trumpets are blown, there is a sacrifice to God, and no work is done. The Day of Atonement, where Israel asks for forgiveness and sacrifices to God, and if they do any work, they will be personally executed by God. And the Feast of the Tabernacles, where no work is done for 7 days. Offerings are sacrificed to the Lord, and the people of Israel rejoice to the Lord and dwell in booths. Wow, the Jews got a lot of free holiday time off. All these celebrations were to be sacrificed for eternity. Oh, geez, God, I think I might have some bad news for you, bro. Then the Lord explained to Moses that Aaron had to keep the tabernacle lamps lit continuously, and the bread of the tabernacle had to be constantly remade so that Aaron and his sons could keep eating it in the holy place before the Lord. Then the book takes a bit of a departure and tells of how one day a man blasphemed in Israel out of anger, and was brought before Moses, and God told Moses that the penalty for cursing and blaspheming was stoning to death, the penalty for murder was death, the penalty for killing an animal was redeeming that animal, and the penalty for disfigurement was disfigurement. So then the blasphemer was taken out of camp and stoned to death by the congregation of Israel, as was commanded by God. Then God spoke of the Sabbath of the 7th year, where no work was to be done, and there was to be a solemn rest to the Lord for his sake, where no food was to be grown, and every 7 years Israel would eat of the produce of the previous year, as God would multiply it by 3 times, to eat so that they would be eating old produce for 2 years. Sounds delicious. Then God talked about the year of the Jubilee, where every 50 years the trumpet would sound throughout the land, and all the possessions that had been bought or loaned by the people of Israel would be returned back to their original owners, and slaves would be freed, and no work was to be done, nor any food gathered from the fields. And honestly, all I'm thinking about right now is how much vacation time the Israelites get. It's a pretty sweet deal. Then God told the Israelites of the property laws, and how all the land technically belonged to him, and how if a man wanted to redeem property before the Jubilee, they had to pay the original price for it, but during the time of the Jubilee it would be given back to them for free. But if property within a walled city was not redeemed within 1 year, it would not be redeemed at the Jubilee, and would be kept by the buyer forever. The houses of the cities of the Levites could be redeemed at any time, and the fields of the common lands will not be sold because they belong to all of Israel. Then God tells the Israelites to always be kind and care for the poor, and to fear the Lord. And then he gave his law concerning slavery, which was, if a poor Israelite sells himself to you, he will only be an indentured servant and will be released at the Jubilee, or before that, if they or their family members are able to redeem them. But when you buy any non-Israelite heathen, then they will be your permanent slaves, and your children can inherit them after you. And any children your slaves bear will also be inherited. Then God said to the Israelites, do not make any idols for yourselves, and bow down to them, for I am the Lord your God, and you must keep my Sabbaths and work in my ways. And if you do, I will give you fruit and produce in abundance in the land, and you will dwell in safety and peace with no beasts to harm you. And I will chase all your enemies away from you and have them slaughtered, and will continually multiply you because of my covenant that I made. And I will walk amongst you as your God, and you will be my people. But if you do not obey me in all that I say, I will bring terror and disease to consume your eyes, and bring your enemies upon you to oppress you. Your strength will be spent in vain, and I will repay your offenses 7-fold, and destroy your livestock and crops, and your roads, and decrease you in number. And I will execute my vengeance, and send pestilence, and kill your children. I will deliver you to your enemies, and you will go hungry, and be forced to cannibalize your own children. I will destroy your high places, idols, and altars you have created. I will destroy your cities. I will scatter you among the nations, and the land will be desolate because of your sin. And the few who do survive will be sold to the surrounding peoples, and will live in fear, and will perish in their iniquity in the end. But if you do confess your great unfaithfulness to me, and accept your guilt, Then I will remember my covenant, and I will not utterly destroy you. And I will be your Lord again, and bring you out of the land of your enemies. Then the Lord gave Moses the prices that were to be paid if the people were consecrated to the Lord, and the price was less if they were women, children, or old men. Then the Lord again said that any animal sacrificed to him had to be holy, and that if the person wanted to redeem the animal, they would have to pay an extra 20% from the original price. And that if anyone sold his house to a priest and wished to redeem it, then that person had to pay an extra 20% from the original price. And that if a person ever offered up his field to the priest and wanted to redeem it, that person would have to pay an extra 20% from the original price, or just wait for the year of the Jubilee and get it back for free. The evaluations of payment were according to the shekel, equal to 20 gerahs, and the firstborn clean animals must be the Lord's and could not be redeemed unless they were unclean, and any devoted offering that has been given to the Lord could not be taken back, and anyone trying to do so would be executed. Finally, all of Israel had to pay a tax of 1/10 to the Lord, despite God not really having any need for possessions. The end.